Bonjour à tous. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Learn French with Madame. Today, we are going to talk about accent changing verbs. So you can see on my note sheet up here, I've got two verbs written out with our verb chart. We're going to talk about these two verbs as our main example, and then we're going to talk about some other verbs later on. So the first thing that I want to talk about is what these verbs mean, and then we'll talk about what I mean by accent changing verbs. So first off, the verb préférer on our left-hand side over here, take a guess as to what you think préférer means. Oui, it means to prefer. Like I prefer this, you prefer that. Our second verb that we have is the verb acheter on the right-hand side. And so acheter is the verb to buy. As in, I am going to buy this, you are going to buy that. So now let's talk about what it means to have an accent changing verb. So what I mean by accent changing is that with the verb préférer, so with our first verb right here, préférer, those accents that are on there are going to change when we conjugate the verb. So it's not always going to look like it does now with the two accent aigus. And with acheter, it doesn't start with an accent in the stem, but it's going to get an accent when we conjugate it. So the best thing that we can do is to just go through and try to conjugate our verb. So I'm going to start off with préférer, and we're going to go through and conjugate all of that, and then we're going to go through and try acheter. All right? So with préférer, I am going to draw a little circle around this boot because it's helpful to know that everything inside of this boot right here is going to conjugate the same way with those accents. So it's going to conjugate like a normal ER verb would with the right endings with E, ES, E, etc., etc. The only difference is with the accents. That's why we're learning them this way. So let's go ahead and jump right in to conjugating our verb. So first, I'm going to go through and write my stem. So let's write our stem with no accents first. All right. So I've got my stem written down for the first three. Now let's go through and add on our endings. So our endings, we're going to stick with the normal ER verb endings. So for je, we would normally add an E. For tu, we would normally add ES. For il, elle, on, we would normally add an E. Now, this is where we start talking about our accent changing, all right? So with accent changing, this is where it's going to get a little bit tricky, but not super tricky. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to draw my accents in a different color so that way you guys can see them. So I'm going to draw my accents in green. So for all three of these, we're going to make a house. So these two accents are both pointing to the right, but when we conjugate these ones, we're going to make a house. And if you've ever drawn a house before, you start off like that. So we're going to just do that with our accents. So we take that first one, and the first one stays the same, but the second one switches from an accent aigu to an accent grave. So we're just going to switch that second accent. So we will go from préférer to préfère. So remember that accent grave brings it down, préfère. All right, now let's do new. So we're going to write our stem with no accent, and let's do vous while we're at it. All right, so now let's add on our endings. For new, we would normally add on what? Yes, O-N-S. We would normally add on O-N-S. So we're going to add on our O-N-S. Okay, and for vous, what would we add on to the end for vous? Oui, Z. Excellent. Okay, so now Before we move on, nu and vu are outside of our little shoe. So those accents are going to stay the same. We're going to keep them, the two accent aigus. So we can just add those right on. All right, now we only have one more to do. So let's fill in our stem. And what would we add onto the end for il and el plural? We, ent, E-N-T. So we're going to add on E-N-T. And now since this one is inside of our shoe, what are we going to do with those two accents? Do they stay the same or do we change them? We change them. So we change them to make a house. All right. So verbs like préférer, when they have two accents or they start off with two accents, or there's only an accent on this second E, then you're going to switch the accent. So let's talk about some verbs that are like préférer. So I've got a little list down here that we're going to fill in. All right, so our first verb that's like préférer is the verb espérer. Espérer. And espérer is the verb to hope or to wish for. So we're going to say to hope. So espérer is the verb to hope. So when we conjugate the verb espérer, there's only one accent, but it's on the second E. So this accent is going to switch to that accent aigu. Our second verb that is like the verb préférer is the verb répéter, which you've seen a lot before. So répéter has two accents, so it makes it a little bit easier to make that connection because répéter is going to switch those two accents and go from two accent aigus to two accents looking like a house. So répéter is pretty easy to figure out what it means. It means to repeat. All right, let's talk about the verb acheter now. So let's talk about the verb acheter. We're going to do pretty much the same thing like we did with préférer, but we're going to just do it with a different verb. So I'm going to draw my little boot again. And then we're going to fill in our boot with our conjugations. We're going to fill in our stem first and then our endings, and then we'll go through and fill in our accents. So the first thing that we need to fill in is our stem. So remember, to get the stem, we're going to drop off this ER and write down what's left. That is our stem. So if we take off this ER, we're left with Acheter. So we're going to write down our stem. Okay, so now we have our stem written down for our first three. Let's go through and add on our endings. So for je, we know that we're going to add an E. For tu, we're going to add es, es, and il, on, we're going to add or e. Now we need to get to the part with accent changing. So acheter doesn't start with an accent, but in all of the forms inside this shoe or this boot right here is going to get an accent. So here is our accent changing part. All of these forms inside this boot are going to get an accent grave on this E. So we're going to add an accent grave right there. So it becomes Acheter. So we kind of bring it up a little bit and then we bring our ending down. Acheter. All right, let's fill in our stem for the right-hand side of our chart. So the right-hand side of our chart, we have Acheter, Acheter, and Acheter. My pen is running out. All right, so now that we have our stem filled in, let's add on our endings. For nu, we know we get ons, and for vu, we get ez. Because these two are outside of the boot, we don't add an accent. So just like with préférer, we didn't change that accent. With nu and vu, we're going to leave it alone. We don't add an accent. For il and elle plural, we're still going to add on the ENT that we normally would. And since it's inside the boot, we're going to add our accent grave. All right, so with acheter, it's important to remember it doesn't start with an accent, but it finishes with an accent grave inside of this boot. All right, let's talk about some verbs like acheter. So some verbs like acheter, we have, our first one is amene. 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 I'm going to switch out my pen here. So amene is the verb to bring along, as in like I'm going to bring along my brother. That's a little bit better. You can see that. So amene is the verb to bring along. So with the verb amene, we're going to end up getting an accent grave on that E right there that's underlined. Our second verb is the verb emene. And emene is the verb to take along. So there's a difference between to bring along and to take along. To bring along and to take along. So you would bring along your brother to the movies, or you would take your brother to school. Try to think of it that way. All right, and then we're going to get an accent grave on that E. Our next verb is the verb lever, which you've heard me say a little bit before. Lever is the verb to raise. So I've said levez-vous, which means raise yourself. It means stand up. Or I've said lève ta main, raise your hand. And so we're going to get an accent on this E. It can't be this E because we're going to end up taking that E off. Remember, that's part of our ending. So it has to be on that E. And our last verb that is like the verb acheter is promener. Promener. So the verb promener is the verb to walk. And we're going to get an accent on this E right there. So promener, the verb to walk. So a real quick recap before we finish the video for today. A couple things to remember is that verbs like préférer are going to switch an accent or gain an accent. So préférer is going to switch accents. Even if it only has one accent like espérer, it's still going to switch that accent. Verbs like acheter are going to add an accent. So if they're verbs like acheter, they don't start with an accent. They're going to get an accent in the final form. Okay? Hopefully the verbs préférer and acheter aren't super hard, but if you need a little bit of extra help, feel free to reach out for an email. I'd be happy to go over it with you again. If you have any questions, don't forget you can always reach out. Mais c'est tout et à plus.